The defendant, Isaac Walker, received a sentence of 65 years for the shooting. But the trial could never truly explain the darkness that led a man to commit an act of such shocking violence for just $40. And investigators were about to discover that the key to his motive was not found in the cash register, but in a single, overlooked shell casing left behind. A store clerk named Hazel Torres was shot in the head and killed during a robbery that netted the perpetrator a meager $40. The brutal and senseless crime sent a shockwave of fear through the community, highlighting a shocking disregard for human life. This act of disproportionate violence occurred not in a sprawling metropolis known for its crime, but in the rugged, remote city of Billings, Montana. The incident would come to define the city for a time, a stark reminder that even in Big Sky country, darkness can descend with sudden and irreversible finality. The night of the murder began as countless others had in this quiet corner of Billings, a city where the vast emptiness of the plains seems to press in on the edges of civilization. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the faint industrial hum of the city itself. Inside the well-lit sanctuary of the Big Sky Stop and Go, Hazel Torres was finishing her shift, the routine tasks of stocking shelves and wiping down counters a familiar comfort against the late-hour quiet. The bell above the door, which usually announced the arrival of a weary traveler or a local grabbing milk, was about to signal the end of her life. The perpetrator, Isaac Walker, did not enter with the obvious menace of a career criminal, but with the quiet desperation of a man whose world had shrunk to a single, terrible point of focus. He moved with a practiced nonchalance that was more chilling than any overt threat, browsing the aisles for a moment as if contemplating a purchase. Hazel offered a polite, tired greeting, her mind already on the drive home, and the promise of a warm bed. For a moment, the scene was utterly normal, a mundane transaction about to take place under the sterile fluorescent lights of a convenience store. But then the facade shattered when Isaac Walker approached the counter, not with a bag of chips, but with a cold, black handgun. The demand for money was low and guttural, a stark contrast to the polite silence that had filled the space moments before. Hazel Torres, trained for this possibility, yet still paralyzed by the reality of it, complied without resistance, her hands trembling as she opened the cash register. She knew the store's policy was to give them whatever they wanted, that her life was worth more than the contents of the till, a lesson that would prove tragically useless in the face of irrational violence. The contents of the register were slim, a testament to a slow Tuesday night and the prevalence of credit card transactions. A handful of bills, amounting to no more than $40, was all Hazel had to offer the armed man standing before her. She pushed the small pile of cash across the counter, her eyes pleading, hoping this offering would be enough to purchase her life back. The money represented so little in the grand scheme of things, the price of a few gallons of gas or a cheap dinner, yet in that moment it was everything. Isaac Walker scooped the money into his pocket with one hand, his other hand never wavering, the gun still pointed directly at Hazel's face. There was a pause, a terrifying drawn-out silence where the outcome still hung in the balance. It was in this moment that the crime transcended from a simple robbery into something far more monstrous. The act was no longer about the $40, it was about power, about a final, irrevocable decision made in the heart of a desperate man. Without another word, he pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small enclosed space, a single, sharp crack that ripped through the quiet of the Montana night. Hazel Torres fell, her life extinguished in an instant, the victim of a level of brutality that defied all reason and comprehension. The killer stared down at what he had done for a brief second, his face a mask of cold indifference, before turning and walking out of the store. He disappeared back into the darkness from which he came, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The $40 in his pocket felt insignificant, almost an afterthought to the cataclysmic violence he had just unleashed. In the rugged landscape of Billings, a city where people often came to escape their pasts and disappear into the anonymity of the West, Isaac Walker had just created a ghost that would haunt the community forever. The silence that followed the gunshot was profound, broken only by the hum of the beverage cooler and the slow, steady drip of a coffee machine, indifferent witnesses to a life stolen for pocket change. The city of Billings, nestled under the vast and often unforgiving sky, was about to wake up to a new and terrifying reality, one where the quiet solitude it offered could also hide the most depraved of human actions. The investigation that would follow would have to navigate not just the physical evidence of the crime, but the psychological terrain of a killer for whom a human life was worth less than a tank of gas. It was a journey into the heart of a senseless act, a quest for answers in a place that prided itself on simple truths and straightforward justice. Hazel Torres was more than just a name on a police report or a tragic headline in the Billings Gazette. She was a vibrant thread in the fabric of the community. She was a daughter, a friend, and a dreamer, a young woman who had moved to Billings with aspirations that stretched as high and wide as the Montana sky itself. The city, for her, was not a place to disappear, but a place to begin, a rugged frontier where she believed she could build a life of purpose and meaning. Her death left a void that could never be filled, a silence that was louder and more painful than any cry for justice. Born and raised in a small town in neighboring Wyoming, Hazel had always been drawn to the open spaces and the quiet dignity of the American West. She possessed a gentle spirit, but a resilient will, a combination that made her both kind and determined. She had come to Billings to attend Montana State University Billings, where she was studying to become an elementary school teacher, a profession that perfectly suited her patient and nurturing soul. The job at the Big Sky Stop and Go was a means to an end, a way to pay for tuition and textbooks while she worked toward her dream of shaping young minds. Her friends and family remembered her for her infectious laugh and her unwavering optimism, qualities that seemed to stand in stark defiance of the often harsh realities of the world. She found beauty in the simple things, the fiery sunsets over the Yellowstone River, the first snowfall of winter, a shared cup of coffee with a friend. Hazel had a gift for making people feel seen and heard, for turning a mundane transaction at a convenience store into a moment of genuine human connection. Regular customers knew her by name and she knew theirs, always ready with a warm smile and a kind word. She was an artist at heart, filling sketchbooks with detailed drawings of the local flora and fauna, capturing the rugged beauty of the Montana landscape that she had grown to love so deeply. Her small apartment was filled with her creations, a testament to her unique way of seeing the world. She dreamed of one day illustrating children's books, of combining her passion for art with her desire to educate and inspire the next generation. It was a future filled with promise, a canvas waiting to be painted with the bright colors of her ambition. The world lost that future in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the convenience store. It lost the teacher who would have comforted a crying child on their first day of school, the artist who would have brought joy to thousands with her illustrations, the friend who would have been a steadfast source of support and laughter. Her death was not just the end of one life, but the erasure of countless potential moments of kindness and creativity. The $40 that Isaac Walker stole was a pittance compared to the immeasurable value of the future he extinguished. Her parents, who still lived in the same small Wyoming town where she was raised, were devastated by the news. The drive to Billings was the longest of their lives, a journey through the familiar landscapes their daughter had loved, now tainted by an unimaginable grief. They had always been proud of her independence and her courage for moving to a new city to pursue her dreams, never imagining that her journey would end in such a violent and senseless way. Arriving in the rugged city, they found themselves in a place that suddenly felt alien and hostile, its wide open spaces now seeming to mock them with their emptiness. The community of Billings, though accustomed to a certain level of frontier toughness, was deeply shaken by the murder. It was the kind of crime that people read about happening in other bigger cities, not in their own backyard. A makeshift memorial of flowers, candles, and handwritten notes quickly grew outside the Big Sky Stop and Go, a spontaneous outpouring of grief from friends, customers, and strangers alike. The messages spoke of a shared sense of loss and disbelief, a collective mourning for a young woman who represented the best of their community. Hazel's friends from the university gathered to share memories, their conversations filled with tears and laughter as they recalled her quirky sense of humor and her unwavering kindness. They talked about late-night study sessions, weekend hikes in the Beartooth Mountains, and dreams shared over cheap pizza. In their stories, Hazel was alive again, a bright shining light that had been cruelly snuffed out. For them, the city of Billings would forever be divided into two distinct periods: the time before Hazel's death and the dark, uncertain time that followed. The loss of Hazel Torres was not just a private tragedy, but a public wound, a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the senselessness of violence. Her story became a cautionary tale, a symbol of innocence lost in a world that too often rewards brutality. The quest for justice was no longer just about catching a killer. It was about honoring the memory of a young woman whose life was a masterpiece of kindness, a life that was stolen for the price of a few crumpled bills. The first call to 911 came not from a witness, but from a customer who entered the Big Sky Stop and Go just minutes after the murder. He was a long-haul trucker looking for a hot cup of coffee to fuel the next leg of his journey across the vast Montana plains. What he found instead was a scene of chilling stillness, a silence that was immediately and deeply wrong, punctuated only by the low hum of the coolers. Behind the counter lay the body of Hazel Torres, a sight that would be seared into his memory forever. When the first Billings Police Department patrol car arrived, the officers were met with a scene that was both tragic and baffling. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned displays or scattered merchandise. Everything was neat and orderly, except for the single, devastating act of violence that had occurred behind the register. The cash drawer was open and empty, immediately suggesting that robbery was the motive. But the sheer brutality of the crime, a close-range execution, seemed wildly disproportionate to the petty theft of a few dollars. Lead Detective Savannah Parker was called to the scene, her breath misting in the cold night air as she stepped under the yellow police tape. Parker was a veteran of the department, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator whose reputation was built on her meticulous attention to detail. She had seen her share of violence in Billings, a city that often attracted transient individuals trying to outrun their problems, but this case felt different. The combination of calculated violence and a trivial motive created a disturbing psychological profile of the killer. Her first 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity, a race against time to gather evidence before it could degrade or disappear. The forensic team dusted for fingerprints, swabbed for DNA, and carefully documented every inch of the crime scene. They recovered the single bullet casing that had been ejected from the killer's gun, a small piece of brass that held the potential to unlock the entire case. Detective Parker knew that in a crime with no witnesses, this tiny object could become their most important piece of evidence. The store's surveillance system was an immediate focus, but it quickly proved to be a source of frustration. The camera was old, its lens clouded with dust, and the resulting footage was grainy and indistinct. It showed a figure, a man of average height and build, wearing a hooded sweatshirt that obscured his face, but his features were impossible to make out. The video captured the terrible, silent pantomime of the robbery and murder, but it offered few clues as to the killer's identity. Detective Parker and her team spent hours scrutinizing the blurry footage, searching for any unique characteristic, a limp, a tattoo, a specific brand of clothing that could help them identify the man. They could see him take the cash, a small handful of bills, and they could see the moment he raised the gun. But the low resolution of the video turned his face into a smudge of pixels, a ghost who had appeared, committed an atrocity, and then vanished back into the rugged anonymity of the city. With the surveillance footage offering little help, the investigation turned to the streets. Parker assigned officers to canvass the area, knocking on doors of nearby homes and businesses, hoping someone might have seen or heard something unusual. They spoke to transients in the nearby parks and residents of the low-rent motels that dotted the outskirts of town, places where people on the fringes of society often disappeared. But the late hour of the crime meant that few people were out, and no one had a clear recollection of seeing the man in the hooded sweatshirt. The missing $40 became a central focus of the early investigation. It was such a specific, small amount that it suggested a particular kind of desperation. This wasn't a professional criminal looking for a big score. This was likely someone who needed a small amount of cash and needed it badly. Detective Parker began to build a theory that their killer was not a hardened gangster, but someone on the edge, a person whose life had unraveled to the point where $40 was worth taking a life. The initial autopsy report confirmed what the officers at the scene had already concluded. Hazel Torres had died from a single gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range. There were no other injuries, no signs of a struggle. She had complied with the robber's demands, and he had killed her anyway. This detail was particularly chilling to Detective Parker, as it spoke to a level of cold-bloodedness that was deeply unsettling. As the second day of the investigation drew to a close, the pressure was mounting. The media had seized on the story, and the public was demanding answers. The murder of Hazel Torres had shattered the sense of security in Billings, and people were looking to the police to restore it. But with no clear suspect, no usable surveillance footage, and no witnesses, Detective Parker knew that they were facing an uphill battle. The killer was a ghost, a shadow who had left behind little more than a dead body and a single, all-important shell casing. In a city built on the vast, open frontier, the search for one man felt like searching for a needle in an endless haystack. For nearly a week, the investigation into Hazel Torres's murder seemed to be at a standstill. The grainy surveillance video was released to the public, but the featureless man in the hooded sweatshirt was an everyman, a ghost who could be anyone. Detective Savannah Parker and her team followed up on dozens of fruitless tips, chasing down leads that led to dead ends, the frustration mounting with each passing day. The city of Billings remained on edge, the community's grief slowly turning to fear as the killer remained at large, a nameless shadow who had proven capable of extreme violence for the most trivial of reasons. The break in the case came not from a high-tech forensic discovery, but from an old-fashioned piece of police work, a confidential informant, a man with a long history of petty crimes, whom Parker had dealt with in the past, reached out with a piece of information he thought might be relevant. He was nervous, afraid of getting involved, but his conscience, or perhaps the promise of leniency on another matter, had compelled him to make the call. He told Parker about a man he knew, someone who had been acting erratically and seemed desperate for cash around the time of the murder. The name he gave was Isaac Walker. The informant described Walker, a man in his late 30s, as a loner, a drifter, who had bounced around Billings for a few years, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. Recently, however, Walker had lost his job at a local construction site and was facing eviction from his small apartment. The informant mentioned hearing Walker complain bitterly about needing to come up with a small amount of money for rent, a figure that was strikingly close to the $40 stolen from the Big Sky Stop and Go. This was the first real lead the investigation had, and Detective Parker pursued it with cautious optimism. A background check on Isaac Walker revealed a spotty history, but nothing that pointed to a capacity for this level of violence. He had a few minor charges for disorderly conduct and public intoxication from years past, but no record of armed robbery or assault. On the surface, he didn't fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer, but Parker knew that desperation could push ordinary people to do extraordinary and terrible things. The investigation began to pivot, focusing all of its resources on this new person of interest. Detectives set up a discreet surveillance operation on Walker's apartment building, a rundown complex on the industrial side of town. They began digging into his life, interviewing former co-workers, his landlord, and anyone else who might have had contact with him in the days leading up to the murder. A picture began to emerge of a man under immense pressure, isolated and with a growing sense of hopelessness. His landlord confirmed that Walker was behind on his rent and had been served with an eviction notice the day before the murder. He described Walker as quiet and sullen, a man who rarely made eye contact. Former co-workers at the construction site said he had been fired for his temper, for getting into a heated argument with a foreman over a perceived slight. They painted a portrait of a man with a short fuse who felt the world was against him. The most damning piece of information came from an interview with a pawn shop owner in downtown Billings. A detective showing Walker's photo got a flicker of recognition. After checking his records, the owner confirmed that Isaac Walker had been in his shop a few weeks prior, not to sell anything, but to buy something, a box of 9mm ammunition. The caliber matched the shell casing found at the crime scene. With this new information, Detective Parker felt the net beginning to tighten around Isaac Walker. The narrative was becoming clearer. A man who was down on his luck, facing homelessness, and with a volatile temper, buys ammunition for a gun, and then, just days later, a robbery occurs for the exact amount of money he desperately needs. It was still circumstantial, but the coincidences were piling up too high to be ignored. The ghost in the surveillance video was starting to get a face. Parker now had enough to obtain a search warrant for Walker's apartment and, more importantly, for his person, to collect a DNA sample. The legal process moved quickly, with a judge agreeing that there was sufficient probable cause to proceed. The surveillance team watching Walker's apartment reported that he had barely left the building since the murder, a behavior that was consistent with someone trying to lay low. The quiet man who had drifted into Billings, hoping to disappear into the vastness of Big Sky country, was now the singular focus of a major homicide investigation. His isolation, which had once provided him with anonymity, now made him a prime suspect. Detective Parker prepared her team for the next phase of the operation, a direct confrontation with the man they believed had killed Hazel Torres. The time for surveillance and background checks was over. It was time to knock on Isaac Walker's door. The execution of the search warrant was a quiet, methodical affair, designed to catch Isaac Walker completely by surprise. In the early morning hours, before the sun had risen over the rimrocks surrounding Billings, Detective Savannah Parker and a small team of officers approached Walker's apartment. There was no dramatic SWAT team raid, just a firm knock on the door. When a groggy and disheveled Isaac Walker opened it, he was met with the calm, authoritative presence of law enforcement and the sight of a warrant for the search of his home. Walker offered no resistance, his face a blank canvas of confusion and weary resignation. As officers escorted him to a waiting patrol car to be transported to the station for questioning, the forensic team began their painstaking search of his small, sparsely furnished apartment. The space itself seemed to reflect the emptiness of Walker's life. There were few personal effects, no photographs, no signs of connection to family or friends. It was the home of a man who was truly alone, a man who had successfully disappeared long before he ever became a suspect in a murder. The search of the apartment yielded several key pieces of evidence. In the back of a closet, tucked away under a pile of dirty laundry, detectives found a dark-colored hooded sweatshirt that was nearly identical to the one worn by the killer in the grainy surveillance footage. While not a definitive link on its own, it was another piece of the circumstantial puzzle. A more significant discovery was made in a kitchen drawer, where they found an empty box of 9mm ammunition, the same brand and caliber as the casing recovered from the crime scene. But the most crucial piece of evidence was yet to come. In a crawl space under the apartment building, accessible through a loose floorboard in Walker's closet, a detective found a handgun wrapped in an oily rag. It was a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Detective Parker immediately secured the weapon, understanding that if ballistics could match this gun to the casing from the murder scene, their circumstantial case would become nearly airtight. The gun was carefully packaged and sent to the state crime lab for urgent analysis. While the search was underway, Parker's team continued to build the case through other means. They subpoenaed Walker's financial records, which were practically non-existent. He had no bank account, dealing only in cash, which reinforced the theory that he was living on the edge. They also obtained a warrant for his cell phone records, which showed that his phone had been powered off for several hours on the night of the murder, a common tactic used by criminals attempting to avoid location tracking. The forensic analysis of the evidence from the apartment began to yield results. While the sweatshirt had no usable DNA on it, fibers found on it were consistent with those present in the convenience store. The DNA sample taken from Walker himself was also sent to the lab for comparison against any potential trace evidence found at the scene, though Parker knew that the killer had been careful not to leave any biological material behind. The real linchpin of the case was the gun. 2 days later, the call came from the ballistics lab. The results were definitive. The unique microscopic markings on the shell casing found at the scene of Hazel Torres's murder were a perfect match to the test-fired casings from the gun found in Isaac Walker's crawl space. There was no doubt. The gun that had killed Hazel Torres was the same one hidden in the suspect's apartment. Detective Parker now had her murder weapon and a direct physical link between Isaac Walker and the crime. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when detectives re-interviewed the pawnshop owner. After being shown a picture of the recovered firearm, he positively identified it as the one he had sold to Isaac Walker several months earlier. He had a record of the sale including the gun's serial number, which matched the weapon now in police custody. The chain of evidence was complete, a series of seemingly disparate facts that now formed an undeniable narrative of guilt. From a vague tip from an informant, the investigation had methodically built a mountain of evidence against Isaac Walker. They had a motive born of financial desperation, a sweatshirt matching the one in the video, an empty box of the correct ammunition, the murder weapon itself, and a record of the gun sale linking it directly to him. The ghost who had haunted the city of Billings for weeks now had a name, a face, and a history. Detective Savannah Parker had what she needed to move forward. The next step was to confront Isaac Walker with the evidence and see if the weight of it would be enough to break his silence. With the ballistic results confirming a match, Isaac Walker was no longer a person of interest. He was the prime and only suspect in the murder of Hazel Torres. He was formally arrested and charged with armed robbery and first-degree murder while still in custody. The news of the arrest brought a wave of relief to the city of Billings, but for Detective Savannah Parker, the work was far from over. The final crucial step was the interrogation, a psychological battle of wills that could either secure a confession or give the defense team a roadmap of the prosecution's case. Walker was brought into a small, sterile interrogation room, its bare gray walls designed to create a sense of isolation and pressure. He sat hunched over a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him, his expression unreadable. For a 37-year-old man, he looked much older, the hard lines on his face telling a story of a difficult and solitary life. He had spent his time in custody in silence, refusing to answer any questions without a lawyer present, a right he was now exercising. Detective Parker entered the room with a calm, measured demeanor, accompanied by another detective. She placed a thick file on the table between them, the label Homicide, Torres, H, clearly visible. She began not with accusations, but with simple questions about his life in Billings, his work history, his apartment. Walker's answers were short and non-committal, delivered in a low monotone, his court-appointed lawyer sitting silently beside him, observing the exchange. Parker patiently worked to establish a baseline, to get a feel for Walker's personality and his potential weaknesses. He was guarded and detached, showing no emotion, not even anger or fear. It was as if he was watching the events unfold from a great distance, a passive observer in his own life's drama. Parker recognized this as a powerful defense mechanism, a wall he had built around himself to cope with a world he felt had rejected him. After an hour of circling the issue, Parker shifted her approach. She began to introduce the evidence, laying it out piece by piece, like a builder laying stones for a foundation. She spoke about the $40, the eviction notice, the desperation he must have been feeling. She watched his eyes for any flicker of reaction, but Walker remained impassive, his gaze fixed on a point on the wall just over her shoulder. Then she slid a photograph across the table. It wasn't a gruesome crime scene photo, but a smiling, vibrant picture of Hazel Torres, taken on a sunny day during a hike. "This is Hazel," Parker said softly. "She was studying to be a teacher. She liked to draw." For the first time, Walker's eyes moved, darting down to the photograph for a fraction of a second before looking away. It was a small crack in his armor of indifference, the first sign that he was not as disconnected as he appeared. Next came the physical evidence. Parker described the hooded sweatshirt found in his closet, the empty box of ammunition in his kitchen. Walker's lawyer shifted in his seat, but advised his client to remain silent. The suspect's breathing became slightly more shallow, but his expression remained blank. The final piece was the murder weapon. "We found your gun, Isaac," Parker stated, her voice even and steady. "We found it hidden under your apartment, and the ballistics lab confirmed it's the same gun that fired the bullet that killed Hazel." She paused, letting the weight of the statement fill the silence in the room. "The bullet casing we found at the scene has the exact same markings. It's a perfect match. There's no way to explain that away." At the mention of the definitive ballistics match, a subtle change came over Isaac Walker. The impenetrable mask of detachment finally began to crumble. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and he broke his silence, not with a confession, but with a muttered, almost inaudible question. "How did you find it?" he asked, his voice raspy from disuse. It was the opening Parker had been waiting for. It was an implicit admission of knowledge, a confirmation that he knew the gun was there, and that he knew it was significant. She didn't answer his question directly, instead pressing her advantage. "It's over, Isaac," she said, her tone shifting from inquisitorial to something closer to resignation. "We know what you did. What I need to understand is why. Why for $40? Walker slumped in his chair, the last of his resistance seeming to drain out of him. He didn't offer a full confession, but he began to talk in a rambling, disjointed way about his life, about the constant failures, the bad luck, the feeling of being invisible. He spoke of the eviction notice as the final straw, the ultimate symbol of his inability to function in the world. He never explicitly said, "I shot her," but his narrative was one of a man pushed to the edge, a man for whom a small act of violence had become the only way to exert control over a life that was spiraling into chaos. The interrogation ended without a signed confession, but it had achieved its purpose. Walker's question about the gun was a critical, undeniable admission of guilt that could be used in court. His rambling monologue painted a clear picture of his motive and state of mind. He was not a monster in the traditional sense, but a broken man who had committed a monstrous act. As he was led back to his cell, Isaac Walker seemed to fade back into his shell of invisibility, leaving Detective Parker with the grim satisfaction of knowing that the ghost of Billings had finally been captured. 6 months after the murder of Hazel Torres, the trial of Isaac Walker began at the Yellowstone County Courthouse in downtown Billings. The case had captivated the local public, and the gallery was filled each day with a mix of concerned citizens, members of the media, and the grieving family and friends of the victim. Isaac Walker, now clean-shaven and dressed in a borrowed suit, sat beside his defense attorney, looking more like a weary accountant than a man accused of a brutal murder. His detached demeanor, which had been so prominent during his interrogation, had returned, creating an unnerving presence at the defense table. The prosecution was led by Serenity Murphy, a seasoned and highly respected deputy county attorney known for her methodical and compelling courtroom style. In her opening statement, she walked the jury through the events of that tragic night, her voice filled with a quiet, controlled anger. She painted a vivid picture of Hazel Torres, a bright young woman with a future full of promise, and contrasted it with the cold, calculated actions of the man who had taken it all away. Murphy's strategy was clear from the outset, to frame the crime not as a robbery gone wrong, but as a deliberate and senseless execution. "This wasn't about the money," she declared, her eyes fixed on the jury. "The $40 was just the excuse. This was about a man, Isaac Walker, who was so consumed by his own failures, so filled with rage at the world, that he chose to extinguish a bright light of a life for no reason at all. This was an execution for pocket change." She methodically laid out a roadmap of the evidence she would present: the grainy surveillance video, the testimony from the informant, the discovery of the hooded sweatshirt, the empty box of ammunition, and finally the murder weapon. She saved the most powerful piece for last, explaining in clear, simple terms the science of ballistics. "The state's evidence will show beyond any doubt that the gun found in the defendant's possession is the one and only gun on this earth that could have fired the shot that killed Hazel Torres," she concluded, her voice resonating through the silent courtroom. On the other side, Walker's defense attorney, a public defender named Elias Vance, faced an uphill battle. With a mountain of physical evidence against his client, he knew that a traditional not guilty defense was unlikely to succeed. Instead, his strategy was to introduce doubt and to attack the why of the crime, suggesting that the prosecution's narrative of a cold-blooded execution was an oversimplification. He intended to argue that this was a tragic, impulsive act committed by a man in the throes of a mental health crisis, not a premeditated murder. In his opening statement, Vance portrayed Isaac Walker not as a monster, but as a victim of circumstance, a man who had fallen through the cracks of society. He described Walker's isolation, his job loss, and his impending eviction, painting a picture of a man at the end of his rope. "The prosecution wants you to see a monster," Vance argued, his tone pleading and earnest. "But what the evidence will really show is a tragedy, a perfect storm of desperation and mental anguish that culminated in a terrible, irreversible mistake. Isaac Walker is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a broken man who needs help, not just punishment." Vance's goal was not necessarily to secure an acquittal on the murder charge, but to convince the jury to consider a lesser charge, such as manslaughter. He planned to challenge the element of premeditation, arguing that Walker had acted impulsively and without a clear plan. He would suggest that the gun had discharged accidentally during a moment of panic, or that Walker's mental state was so compromised that he was incapable of forming the intent to kill. Throughout the opening statements, Isaac Walker remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him. He showed no reaction as the prosecutor described him as an executioner, nor as his own attorney painted him as a broken man. His passivity was unsettling, leaving the jury to wonder what was going on behind his blank expression. Was it the cold detachment of a sociopath, or the profound dissociation of a man who could not face the reality of what he had done? As the first day of the trial concluded, the battle lines had been clearly drawn. The prosecution would build a case on the undeniable strength of the physical evidence, a clear and logical path leading directly to Isaac Walker. The defense, in contrast, would wage a war in the murky territory of human psychology, asking the jury to look beyond the facts of the crime and into the mind of the man who had committed it. The stage was set for a dramatic and emotional legal battle, one that would force the community of Billings to confront not only the how of Hazel Torres's murder, but the far more difficult question of why. The prosecution's case unfolded over the next several days with the methodical precision that Serenity Murphy was known for. She called a series of witnesses who, one by one, laid the bricks in the wall of evidence surrounding Isaac Walker. The trucker who discovered Hazel's body gave a somber account of the scene, his voice cracking as he recalled the chilling silence of the store. The first responding officers described the lack of any struggle, reinforcing the image of a compliant victim who was murdered without provocation. The emotional core of the prosecution's case came from the testimony of Hazel Torres's parents. Her mother took the stand, clutching a small frame photograph of her daughter. Through tears, she spoke of Hazel's dreams of becoming a teacher, her love for art, and her kind, gentle spirit. Prosecutor Murphy handled the testimony with grace, allowing the jury to see the immense human cost of the crime, transforming the victim from a name in a file into a beloved daughter whose future had been stolen. But the most damning testimony came from the state's forensic experts. A digital media analyst testified about the grainy surveillance video, freezing the frame on the moment the killer raised the gun. While he couldn't identify the face, he confirmed that the hooded sweatshirt worn by the perpetrator was visually consistent with the one found in Walker's apartment. It was a small but important link connecting the defendant to the scene of the crime. The cornerstone of the trial, however, was the testimony of the ballistics expert from the Montana State Crime Lab. A quiet academic man named Dr. Alistair Finch. He took the stand and explained the science of firearm identification to the jury in clear, understandable terms. He described how every gun leaves a unique set of microscopic scratches, like a fingerprint, on the shell casings it ejects. Using a large screen, he displayed magnified images of the casing found at the crime scene and a test-fired casing from the gun found in Walker's crawl space. He pointed out the identical patterns of striations, the unique markings left by the firing pin, and the ejector. "In my 25 years of experience," Dr. Finch stated calmly, "I have never seen two different firearms produce identical markings. The probability of that is infinitesimal. It is my expert opinion, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, that the shell casing recovered from the murder scene was fired from the pistol recovered from the defendant's residence, and no other." During this testimony, a wave of murmurs went through the courtroom. This was the irrefutable physical evidence, the scientific proof, that tied Isaac Walker directly to the murder. Prosecutor Murphy allowed the expert's conclusion to hang in the air for a moment before finishing her direct examination. On cross-examination, defense attorney Elias Vance tried to poke holes in the testimony, questioning the expert about the possibility of error or contamination, But Dr. Finch remained unshaken, his confidence in the science absolute. The final key witness for the prosecution was Detective Savannah Parker. She walked the jury through the entire investigation, from the initial 911 call to the moment of Walker's arrest. She described the methodical process of following the lead from the informant, the discovery of the evidence in Walker's apartment, and the crucial findings of the ballistics report. Her testimony was clear, professional, and devoid of emotion, presenting the jury with a logical and linear progression of how the police had identified and captured their suspect. The most dramatic moment came when Murphy asked Detective Parker about the interrogation. Parker recounted how Walker had remained silent until she confronted him with the ballistics evidence. "When I told him we had found the gun and that it was a match, he broke his silence," Parker testified. "He looked at me and asked, 'How did you find it?'" This statement, an implicit admission of guilt, landed like a bombshell in the courtroom. It was the moment the prosecution tied the physical evidence directly to the defendant's own words. Vance's cross-examination of Parker was tense. He attempted to portray her as a detective with tunnel vision who had settled on his client early on and ignored other possibilities. He questioned her interrogation techniques, suggesting that she had coerced Walker's statement. But Parker remained calm and professional, defending her actions and reiterating the mountain of evidence that had led her to focus on Isaac Walker. Throughout this damning testimony, Walker sat like a stone, his face an unreadable mask. He did not flinch when the pictures of the gun were displayed, nor did he react when Detective Parker recounted his incriminating words. His cold detachment in the face of such overwhelming evidence was perhaps the most unsettling testimony of all, leaving the jury to wonder if they were looking at a man in shock or a man who simply did not care. As the prosecution rested its case, the weight of the evidence seemed almost insurmountable, leaving the defense with the monumental task of convincing the jury that the story was not as simple as it appeared. The defense's case was brief and, in many ways, an act of desperation. Elias Vance knew he could not refute the physical evidence, so he focused his efforts on humanizing Isaac Walker and arguing for a lesser charge based on his client's diminished mental state. He called a psychologist to the stand who had evaluated Walker and testified that he suffered from chronic depression and an antisocial personality disorder, conditions that could lead to impulsive behavior and a detachment from reality, especially under extreme stress. On cross-examination, however, Serenity Murphy skillfully dismantled the psychologist's testimony. She forced him to admit that while Walker might have a personality disorder, it did not mean he was incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong, nor did it prevent him from forming the intent to kill. She argued that Walker's actions, hiding the gun, turning off his phone, were not the signs of a man in a panicked, dissociative state, but rather the calculated moves of a criminal trying to cover his tracks. The most anticipated moment of the defense was whether Isaac Walker himself would take the stand. After a long discussion, Vance made the strategic decision to keep him off. Walker's cold, detached demeanor would likely be disastrous in front of the jury, and putting him on the stand would open him up to a devastating cross-examination from Murphy. And so the defense rested its case without the jury ever hearing from the accused man himself. In her closing argument, Serenity Murphy walked to the evidence table and picked up the murder weapon, holding it carefully in a gloved hand. "This is not the tool of a broken man who made a mistake," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is the instrument of an executioner. For $40, the defendant, Isaac Walker, appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner for Hazel Torres. He looked her in the eyes, saw her compliance, and pulled the trigger anyway. That is not an impulse. That is a choice." Elias Vance, in his closing, made an emotional appeal to the jury's compassion. He asked them to look beyond the cold facts and see the desperate, isolated man who had been pushed to the brink. Justice for Hazel Torres is not about vengeance, he pleaded. It's about understanding the whole truth. And the truth is that this was a tragedy with two victims, the young woman who lost her life and the man whose mind and spirit were so broken that he was capable of this terrible act. After the closing arguments, the judge gave the jury their instructions, and they filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations. The wait was agonizing for everyone involved. Hazel Torres's parents sat huddled together, praying for a verdict that would honor their daughter's memory. Isaac Walker sat silently, staring at the polished wood of the defense table, his fate now in the hands of 12 strangers. The deliberations were surprisingly short. After just 4 hours, the jury sent a note to the judge, indicating they had reached a verdict. The courtroom quickly filled again, a heavy, anxious silence descending as the jury filed back into the box. Their faces were grim and set, offering no clue as to their decision. The jury foreperson, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, handed the verdict form to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The judge read it silently, his expression unreadable, before handing it back to the clerk to be read aloud. In the matter of the state of Montana versus Isaac Walker, the clerk began, her voice steady. On the charge of armed robbery, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A quiet sob escaped from Hazel's mother. The clerk continued, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom, a final, definitive judgment. Hazel's family and friends erupted in tears of relief and sorrow, hugging each other in a shared release of months of pent-up emotion. Across the aisle, Isaac Walker had no visible reaction. He did not flinch, he did not look down, he did not move a muscle. It was the same chilling emptiness he had displayed throughout the trial, a final act of detachment that was, in its own way, a confession. His attorney, Elias Vance, slumped in his chair, the weight of the inevitable loss finally settling on him. He had fought the best he could with the facts he had, but in the end, the science and the senselessness of the crime were too much to overcome. As officers moved in to take Walker into custody, he stood, turned, and was led out of the courtroom without a backward glance, disappearing from public view for the final time. The community of Billings had its justice, but the verdict, while providing a sense of closure, could do nothing to fill the void left by Hazel's death. The sentencing hearing for Isaac Walker took place several weeks after the guilty verdict. The proceeding was a somber formality, as the first-degree murder conviction carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison in Montana. The only question was whether the judge would grant the possibility of parole. Prosecutor Serenity Murphy argued vehemently against it, citing the cold, calculated nature of the crime and Walker's complete lack of remorse throughout the trial. Before the sentence was handed down, Hazel Torres's father was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. He stood before the judge, his hands trembling as he unfolded a piece of paper, but he chose to speak from the heart instead. He spoke not of anger or a desire for revenge, but of the profound and unending loss his family had suffered. "He didn't just take my daughter's life," he said, his voice thick with emotion as he glanced towards the silent Walker. "He took every birthday she would have celebrated, every child she might have taught, every piece of art she would have created. He took all of that from the world for $40. When it was his turn to speak, Isaac Walker was asked if he had anything to say. For a moment, it seemed as if he might finally offer an explanation, an apology, or some sign of human feeling. He stood, looked blankly at the judge, and after a long, uncomfortable silence, simply said, "No, Your Honor." His final words in a court of law were as empty as his expression, a confirmation of the void at his core. The judge, in his final remarks, called the crime one of the most senseless acts of violence he had ever seen in his career. He spoke of the stark contrast between the minimal gain and the ultimate loss, a theme that had defined the case from the very beginning. He then sentenced Isaac Walker to life in prison for the murder of Hazel Torres, with an additional 15 years for the armed robbery, to be served consecutively. He stipulated that Walker would not be eligible for parole for 65 years, a sentence designed to ensure that the 37-year-old man would spend the remainder of his natural life behind bars. The sentence brought a final, legal end to the case, but the impact on the community of Billings lingered. The Big Sky Stop and Go was sold and rebranded, its new owners hoping to erase the stigma of the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. For a long time, however, residents would drive past the location and remember the story of Hazel Torres, a reminder of the fragility of peace and the potential for darkness to erupt in the most ordinary of places. The city, which often served as a refuge for those seeking to escape their past, had been forced to confront a darkness that had grown within its own borders. Detective Savannah Parker, who had meticulously pieced together the case, closed the file with a sense of professional satisfaction, but personal sorrow. She had done her job and brought a killer to justice, but she knew that no verdict or sentence could ever undo the damage that had been done. The memory of Hazel's smiling face in the photograph she had used during the interrogation would stay with her, a symbol of the innocent life her work was meant to protect. In the end, the story of Isaac Walker and Hazel Torres became a tragic footnote in the history of Billings, Montana. It was a story about how a man's life, filled with quiet desperation and simmering rage, could violently intersect with that of a woman whose life was filled with hope and promise. It was a stark lesson in the true cost of violence, demonstrating how a single, terrible choice, made in a moment of despair over the sum of $40, could create ripples of pain and loss that would spread for years to come. The legacy of the crime was not in the details of the investigation or the drama of the trial, but in the simple, heartbreaking truth of a future that was stolen and a life that was wasted, all for nothing.